excited to jump in. I'm excited as well that I am not the person responsible for a lot of the information you're about to see. I get the honor of presenting it to you, but we're going to do a little question and answer with the lead author on our Mighty Microgrids report, Matt Grimley, at the end of the presentation. So I'll give somewhat of an overview, as you may have come to expect if you follow us in some of our other research. But it'll be a great chance for me to ask some kind of the top-line questions of Matt about the report's findings. And of course, we'll be looking for questions from you throughout the presentation, whether it's clarifying questions or questions about the report's findings. So I'm going to jump in, and as I like to so often, jump in with a question, which is to ask, how much do Americans spend on electricity each year, as a way of providing some context for how microgrids are fitting into this bigger conversation. So I'm hopeful that Rebecca, who has just given the introduction, will be able to set up this poll for us. We've got a few possible answers. We'll take about 30 seconds for folks to plug in their responses, give you a good chance to play with the webinar software here and see what people's responses are. So we have, I believe, 3 different choices, which of course I didn't save in the presentation so I wouldn't give away the answer. Rebecca, are you able to pull that up for us?
Yep, the poll is up right now. We have people buzzing in as we speak. The possibilities are 36 billion, 360 billion, or 1 trillion.
All right. I'm sure most people who have wanted to respond have gotten a chance to. Rebecca, if you could just review the answers, because I actually can't see them in my thing here, and that way I can keep the slides maximized.
Absolutely. I'll share the results right now. We have 10% guessing 36 billion, 63% guessing 360 billion, and 27% guessing $1 trillion.
So the correct answer there was 360 billion, but I appreciate everybody for participating in our little interactive feature. For the folks who guessed other things, don't worry, inflation will eventually make you right if you guessed high. If you guessed low, that is what I like to call the energy democracy optimists, who know that we will eventually all be generating our own electricity and paying a lot less for it. You may have also come across that answer in a number of our reports. It's a number that we'd like to use a lot to talk about the context. 360 billion is about 2% of the country's GDP. So we're obviously talking about a fairly substantial sum, both in terms of a percentage of our economy and also in terms of the round number, which means a lot then for the operation of the electricity system. So I want to talk a little bit about, very quickly, the opportunity that we have and how that juxtaposes with the current status of the electricity system. And so many people have referred to the electric grid as sort of the engineering marvel of the 20th century, but it's also somewhat of an inefficient model, and one in which we're going to need to see some changes in the long term. So, for example, about 2/3 of the electric generation we have is lost as heat, the burning of the fuel. We don't capture that waste heat in most circumstances, and that's something that can change with the different technologies that we have available. We've also seen the outage rate skyrocketing as many weather-related outages in particular are putting more stress on the electric grid. And so we have a context for, and particularly see this in the light of some of the major weather events like Hurricane Sandy that have motivated many people to be interested in greater resiliency at the local level for the electricity system. But we also have unprecedented solutions to address these ills of the aging electric grid. For example, we have solar energy. We now have one installation about every 60 seconds in the United States on residential or commercial or utility scale property, a really remarkable development. And in particular, what I think is important to note here is that how fast we are iterating, how fast we are learning in order to drive down the cost of doing these installations. And that same kind of learning is happening at the personal level with the kind of personalized control that we're having over our energy consumption. This picture here is of my actual wall thermostat in my home, and I am able to control it with an app on my smartphone, and increasingly more and more people are able to have this level of control over their energy consumption. Even my 67-year-old mother, for example, is able to use an app and to control her thermostat to have it turn on automatically when she drives within a certain distance of her home. And so, again, change is happening very rapidly. And again, the power in these tools, of course, is that they can iterate very quickly because they're software-based. So once the technology is there to connect the phone and the thermostat, the changes can happen ever rapidly, and the amount of control that we have can be increased simply by pushing out a software update. And of course, so far, these technologies are really, they have us off to what I would like to call a small start. You know, microgrids so far only represent about 0.1% of total US electricity generation, and much of that is the traditional backup generators, rather than the advanced microgrids that most people are talking about today. And what we're really up against is not only the aging of the electric grid and some of the challenges that it presents, but what I like to call a monopoly problem. And this kind of plays out in two different ways. One is the legal monopoly that we give utility companies in about 2/3 of states, where they have control over a particular service territory, and then economic control, complete economic control over that section of the electricity system. But we also have a cultural monopoly problem, where we have a utility system in which these utilities and the rules that they follow have not encouraged a lot of innovation. I spoke with a utility employee, or I met with a utility employee when I was visiting Tucson, Arizona about a year ago, and he said essentially, we come to work each day to do the same job that we did yesterday. And in an era of rapidly changing technology, that simply is not going to be an ethos or a culture that's going to encourage capturing the most opportunity as we're seeing. So, and the other thing I think that's interesting as well is, again, illustrating this monopoly problem, is that we have a huge investment gap in the distribution infrastructure of our electricity system, and that, of course, is where all the interesting stuff is happening. It's where the distributed solar is plugging in, it's where energy storage, where electric vehicles will be interacting with the grid. And our monopoly utility companies have been actually increasing very strongly investments in high voltage transmission, but lagging in the investment in the distribution grid. And the last thing I think, and this gets back to that issue of monopoly culture that we're having, that we have in most electric utilities, is that while the technologies of the 21st century grid, whether it's solar or energy storage or smartphones and personalized control, are iterating very fast with software or with installations happening on every minute, utilities are slow to iterate. It's like the baker who's trying to perfect his cake recipe, but he's only baking a cake once every 5 years. About the period in which a utility might be building a new power plant. There's not a lot of room for innovation when you're not making a lot of change or or iterating your processes very often. And that cultural problem is one that inhibits utilities from embracing a lot of the opportunities and changes that are happening. So that provides a lot of the context then for microgrids and the opportunities that we have in the 21st century electricity system. And I'm desperately trying to press the arrow key to get this slide to advance. Excuse me for a minute. Let's not leave the webinar. That would be a problem. Excuse me, a little technical problem here. There we go. There we go. Excellent. So this is the context in which we want to talk about, as we've called them, mighty microgrids. So we have utilities with aging infrastructure that can be very inefficient, and yet as an engineering marvel, we have a culture of kind of conservative behavior in an era of rapidly iterating change. And the first thing I want to do is just take a moment to define microgrids. This is the definition that we used in the report. I'm going to stop talking for about 15 seconds to just give you a chance to read it rather than reading it for you. And with apologies to anybody who reads slower than that, the slides will be available after the presentation. This is what I like to call our obligatory illustration of a microgrid. I think what's important here is to recognize you have several different properties all interconnected with one another. You have a controller or an automated computer system that helps control the flow of power between all of these different entities and different storage and electrical generation opportunities, and it all happens behind the substation that leads out to the larger grid. I also think it's useful to look at a way of defining a microgrid in a way that's a little more accessible to folks. And so I think, given that microgrids are sort of in their adolescence, it can be very useful to think of them as sort of the teenager of the electric grid, that they can get along on their own, they are able to make decisions on their own, they may still benefit from being grid connected, and there's a lot of possibility. And we'll get into more of that possibility as we move forward through this presentation. So we're going to ask another question here as a way to tee up some of the examples that we want to talk about of the microgrid systems that we're seeing that are particularly interesting. And so Rebecca will hopefully pull this question up for us, and it's just asking where is one of the first 100% renewable microgrids that's larger than 1 megawatt? We picked that amount sort of arbitrarily, and to be perfectly frank, there in fact may be multiple answers to this. We're thinking of one in particular, but we may all have an opportunity to learn something. So if Rebecca, if you could pull up that question, that would be great.
The question is up, and the options are Vermont, Texas, Alaska, or Maryland.
Excellent. Well, Rebecca, if you could read us the responses, that would be wonderful. Rebecca, you might be muted.
I sure was. All right, we had 35% guess Vermont, 44% guess Texas, 10% guessed Alaska, and Maryland guessed 10%, or 10% guessed Maryland.
Excellent. Well, I'm very excited because one of Matt's assignments after this microgrid webinar might be to go talk with some folks about Texas. But the one example we wanted to start with was the one that we were thinking of, which was in Vermont, the Stafford Hill microgrid. This one stands out in particular for two reasons. One is that it is a 100% renewable energy system with 2.5 megawatts of solar and 2 different battery storage technologies. It also stands out because it was nearly 100% utility funded, and its cost and its economic benefit is positive with more benefits than costs. And to get into a little detail here, the utility funded piece is interesting because the utility we're talking about, of course, is Green Mountain Power, which many of you may be familiar with as a utility that has been at the forefront of many of the utility 2.0, as folks have called it, developments. But they also stand out because one of the reasons that they have embraced this is that they are also the only utility company in the entire country to be registered as a benefit corporation, giving them a legal obligation or an opportunity to address social goods other than maximizing shareholder value. And I think that explains a lot about why their culture seems to be embracing innovation and change, and also stands out so differently from so many other investor-owned utility companies. The second thing I think that's worth noting about Stafford Hill is that in terms of the economic benefit, Stafford Hill is in a place where the wholesale market does allow this microgrid to sell some of its services, whether that's voltage control or helping with grid regulation, these so-called ancillary services that the wholesale market is often looking for, and that battery storage in particular is very good at providing. And so that provides a cash flow or a revenue stream that might not be available to microgrids in other places, something that we can talk more about later here in the presentation. A couple other microgrids that we wanted to feature in this conversation are the University of Texas Austin microgrid, which is actually 0% renewable. It's a combined heat and power facility with natural gas powered, but it provides electricity, heat, and cooling for a 20 million square foot campus. It has enormous economic benefits. I think one of the most remarkable things about this microgrid is that even though the campus has grown along with its energy needs over the past decade, the campus has used no more natural gas over that time period. So they've managed to be more efficient in their consumption and use of particularly the waste heat from the combined heat and power facility. And so and I think this is also interesting because we'll talk with Matt about a little bit later, college campuses in particular are a very opportune place to do microgrids. The last one I want to talk about is one that's in development called the Long Island Community Microgrid. It's about 50-50 fossil fuel versus renewable, but has a fairly substantial amount, 15 megawatts of solar and 25 megawatt hours of energy storage in batteries. I think the thing that stands out here is that even though the Long Island might not meet the strict definition of a microgrid in having an ability to island from the rest of the grid, it's unique in that it is helping to defer transmission and distribution costs that the utility would have otherwise incurred because of congestion and limitations in the local grid system, about $300 million in capital investments that would have been required. And so this kind of so-called community microgrid, something that an organization called the Clean Coalition is working on, in fact they're credited for the photo here, have a real opportunity to address some of those lagging distribution infrastructure needs that we talked about earlier. So it's important to understand that microgrids are rising up out of this technological opportunity. They're addressing some of the needs of the electricity system in the 21st century, but they face what we're calling some macro barriers, and there are 5 of them in particular. I'm going to show you sort of the infographic description of them. There's more in the report, and of course we'll have an opportunity to ask Matt more about the details of these 5 barriers. So the number 1 barrier is that a microgrid is undefined in most state laws. That simply means that because a microgrid isn't written in there, it can sort of fall under the regulatory purview or under statutory definitions that weren't meant for microgrids, such as we'll talk about next, the definition about who can legally sell and distribute energy. So Minnesota is a great illustration of this. We have monopoly electric service territories with very narrow exceptions for who is allowed to sell power to somebody else. Well, if a microgrid is not just a single building, which some folks have called a nanogrid, we'll get into that a little bit more later, but is going to involve multiple customers and perhaps connect them across public right-of-way, that microgrid is most likely going to be considered a public utility. And so the lack of definition and the existence of laws defining what utilities are that date back decades complicates things for building microgrids. The third reason why microgrids can face macro problems is that utilities, of course, often have authority over interconnection requests, and in many cases, states have laws that are somewhat outdated about, and this can apply not just to microgrids, but to distributed solar installations, battery storage, and a host of other items that might want to interconnect with the electricity grid. A fourth thing, and there's more on this in the report in particular, is a lack of a plug-and-play control solution. So the brain behind the microgrid is this automated computer system that decides, how much solar are we going to take right now? How much are we going to put it into storage? How much are we going to use for our immediate power needs? How much might we sell to the electric grid? And the problem is that there's really not a plug-and-play control solution. What we have instead is a lot of custom jobs. We have microgrids that are doing the software development for the controller at the same time that they're building the hardware. And that's not only more expensive, but it means it's harder to replicate. So we're not to the point yet, when I showed the smartphone earlier and its ability to control the thermostat, there are these standardized apps and standardized hardware that make it very easy for people to take advantage of the controlling opportunities of the 21st century electricity system, but on an individual basis, we haven't gotten there yet with microgrids. And the last one is this issue of who pays for it and who benefits. And this is kind of on 2 different levels. For the microgrid specifically, how will the microgrid make revenue? Are there opportunities in the wholesale or retail market to sell their services to the greater grid? And how will those benefits be distributed among the participants in that microgrid, whether it's a single building or multiple unrelated customers? But then there's also the larger level of, are those compensation rates set up in a way that's fair to all of the participants in the grid and not just the microgrid participants? So one way to put into context these 5 barriers is to look at 2 specific states, which I think provide a good illustration of how these rules can play out, whether positively or negatively, for the development of microgrids. So we're going to do that, and we're going to look at New York, which is a leader on microgrid policy, and then Minnesota, which just happens to be where the energy program, the energy initiative for ILSR is located, and so a state that we're fairly familiar with. And a big shout out to the Microgrid Resources Coalition for helping in the development of this information. There's some more detail on this again in the report. So the first thing to look at is state funding, and New York stands out because they have what's called the New York Prize that's providing seed funding for municipal feasibility studies of microgrids. And Minnesota, like many other states, does not provide any kind of financing or incentive for microgrid development. In terms of exemptions from regulations, I highlighted earlier the fact that microgrids aren't well defined in state statute. So under what regulations will they fall? In New York, you have several different exemptions. One of, if you're only on private property, so maybe you're just a nanogrid, then you're not connected across public right-of-way to other resources, or if you use cogeneration, small hydro, or alternative or renewable energy. So there are a couple of exceptions there that can help exempt these microgrids from Public Utilities Commission regulation. In Minnesota, the exemptions are narrower. You are if you're a municipal utility or a cooperative, or if you're that nanogrid format, you're only serving tenants of a single building, or if you serve fewer than 25 people. And people is also kind of a debatable term in the Minnesota legislation. So again, both of them have some limitations and that may make it complicated legally in terms of structuring the microgrid. A third piece here is whether or not microgrids are public utilities. In particular, in New York no longer designates monopoly service territories, and so they are very favorable then to allowing the development of microgrids. Minnesota, on the other hand, has only that exemption I mentioned previously. Only if an entity serves fewer than 25 persons are they exempt from being considered a public utility and being regulated. So it makes it much more difficult in Minnesota to form a microgrid if you are serving multiple customers. There's interconnection rules. These are the letter grades that each of these states receives from the Freeing the Grid report by the Interstate Renewable Energy Council. New York a little bit better than Minnesota because of some limitations and additional hoops that project developers have to jump through in Minnesota for grid connections. There's also retail wholesale market compensation. We alluded to this in the barriers before. New York has a wholesale market in which microgrid or energy storage developers would be able to sell services, and the retail market development is happening as a part of the Reforming the Energy Vision, or REV, process. In Minnesota, there isn't a wholesale market for most of the services that could be provided by the microgrid, and retail compensation is limited to net metering that's only for 1 megawatt facilities or smaller, and in fact that only is in investor-owned utility territory, not for municipal or cooperative customers. And then as far as other barriers go, you know, in some cases we are seeing microgrids being developed by utility companies. In New York with the REV process, distribution utilities may be precluded from owning distribution assets that would be included in a microgrid. And sort of the opposite problem is true in Minnesota, where microgrid developers may in fact see political opposition from vertically integrated utilities that don't want to see competition for customers. So there's still, I think, you know, it's worth, even though there are a number of barriers to microgrids and they're really sort of the adolescent of the electric grid, we've got one last chart to show you that I think really highlights not only the economic pressure that's moving us toward microgrids, but the opportunity that we can seize. And this comes from a report that we did on Hawaii late last year, and simply just maps out the median installed solar cost and the cost for lithium-ion batteries on a per kilowatt hour basis. And what you can see, of course, is that, you know, the rapid iteration in technology, the rapid deployment of solar and of consumer electronics and electric vehicles that are using this battery technology is significantly driving down the cost very quickly. And these are really going to be solar and energy storage, the two core components for a lot of microgrids and microgrid development in the near future. So even though there are a lot of policy barriers to date for microgrid development, we see there being really an enormous opportunity because of the ongoing economic pressure that's simply going to make microgrids and on-site power generation too attractive to ignore. So I think we'll leave it there. I just wanted to highlight that we have a couple of podcasts that we did, one with the Clean Coalition about their community microgrids, and another one with Chris Villarreal, who's the policy director for the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission and also an expert on microgrid development from some of his work for the Public Utilities Commission in California. You can download the full report to get all of the details of the things that we had to gloss over in this presentation. And then I'm going to kick off our question and answer session here. I've got Matt in the room with me, and I'll ask him a few questions to kind of draw out some more of the findings that we had in the report, and then we'll be addressing some of the questions that you've been putting in through the chat window. So again, if you have additional questions, please feel free to put them in the chat window, and then Matt and I will be here to answer them. So Matt, I just wanted to start off, you know, first of all, terrific work on the report. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, what do you see as kind of the most common kind of customers that are interested in microgrids? Is there a particular, you know, kind of customer like the, you know, University of Texas Austin, or other folks that are really the front lines of microgrid development?
Yeah, I think to date the consensus is that MUSH customers are the favored customers in microgrids, and MUSH stands for military bases, universities, schools, and hospitals. So these are places that just don't want to lose power no matter what, or they want to be a community center, or they want to help patients, like they need to have power on at all times. So that's been the traditional backup power, diesel generators, for just when the larger grid goes out and they want to protect what's in their base. Now I think nowadays more commercial operations such as data centers are getting more microgrid capabilities too. And there's also some different government buildings getting microgrid capabilities. So, I mean, it's really opening up right now.
And where are you seeing the, as we kind of highlighted in the presentation, New York and Minnesota kind of stand out as studies in contrast for where there are favorable rules for developing microgrids. Where are you seeing most of the microgrid development so far around the country? Where do you think there might be opportunities going forward?
Yeah, so policy-wise, you're getting on the right path with what New York is doing with the REV process right now, opening up the retail markets. And then California as well, they're starting to incentivize feasibility studies for different microgrids that incorporate electric vehicle charging, high amounts of rooftop solar penetration, and other innovative technologies. So you have that need where they're trying to innovate the market. You have other places where there's high amounts of solar penetration, such as Hawaii, Arizona, California, where they're going to seek to use these technologies to corral in the intermittence of rooftop solar as well. And then you're just going to have, I think, a lot of rural places. I think maybe mentioned in the report, Alaska has the highest number of microgrids right now, and they're all rural off-grid microgrids because there's just no way to economically get the power out there otherwise.
So one thing I always love to be asked when I'm doing research, but I would also like to ask you, was there anything, maybe a preconceived notion you had about microgrids, something that surprised you when you were doing the research for this report?
Yeah, I think there were at least two things. One, I was generally surprised, or at least it confirmed a suspicion that there's such a great diversity of microgrids out there. I mean, everyone says, they're one-offs right now. There's no standardized business model, and while some opportunities are moving forward to standardize that business model or technical arrangement, you have these really fascinating arrangements where they're incorporating all these different kinds of technologies. So like Borrego Springs, hooking up with utility scale solar array while incorporating some demand response techniques inside residential homes while incorporating rooftop solar, and just the amount of new technologies they put in is just, it's amazing. And I think
I should mention Borrego Springs is in the report.
Borrego Springs is in the report, yeah, from San Diego Gas and Electric. And I think the second thing was just how cost effective they could be at this point. I've heard everything that says, they're still, whatever, 5-10 years out, but you have some of them that are starting to operate around the 20 cent per kilowatt hour range and featuring paybacks of less than 10 years. I mean, that's on par with rooftop solar for a residential area, and that's only going to get better and better as solar and storage get cheaper and cheaper too.
So, speaking about kind of the economic benefits that folks are already realizing with microgrids, I'm really interested, one of the things that I remember you came across in the report was this notion of a nanogrid. So this is basically a one building microgrid.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like there's a lot of opportunities for them because a lot of the barriers that we discussed really have to do with the notion of serving multiple customers, sort of mimicking a utility. And folks are saying, okay, well, the nanogrid thing is going to work great because it's sort of like the same way that Solar City could serve a single residential customer and provide them with a lease. That model works in a lot of different states. It sort of flies under the radar to some extent. But it seems like the community and the economic benefits to the community could be a lot greater if we can have these so-called community microgrids. If we can serve multiple unrelated customers, you get economies of scale from that, where you could put solar on a school building or a church or something like that that could serve an entire neighborhood. You could have demand response from all of those different residential properties. What are the possibilities for community microgrids? Do you see their, what are their prospects, relative to the nanogrids that might serve a single building?
Their prospects are good if the policies change. Right now, all the policies, interconnection, franchise rights, utilities exclusive territory, favor microgrids being built behind the meter, that is, serving a single building. Now, you'll get some campus microgrids being built too, but that's just because these campuses have single owners and they have the rights over the ways in which they cross. So, but there's a lot of benefits to be had with community microgrids versus nanogrids. So one is the fact that you can use economies of scale, like you were saying, to beef up, move rooftop solar over this entire grid section, like the Clean Coalition is planning to do out in California or in Long Island. You can utilize a diversity of loads, so you can better position different generation demand response sources along the grid. You can also just allow different forms of mixed ownership, allow more economic returns to the community. So there's just a whole new world out there in some ways to be had with community microgrids that isn't being accessed nowadays with a grid that is focused on customers serving only their own load and a utility that is, for the most part, unwilling to help bridge customers together.
So I have one last question for you, Matt, before we'll take some of the questions that have been provided in the chat window. I see there's quite a few there that I will catch up on. I'll be our facilitator for questions. Navigant and Green Tech Media, who have done some of the most in-depth research on microgrid development, say that in the next 10 years, microgrids could, development could double or even triple. What do you think? Is that number high? Is it too low? Is it about right?
I think it could be a little bit lower. I think you might see a little bit more exponential growth than all of that because, nobody predicted what would happen with solar, and nobody really predicted what's now happening with storage and just the fast amount of innovation that's going on. You're going to see these things popping up all over the place at this point. I mean, New York in the next 2 years, they have 83 feasibility studies going on across the state. They're, amazing mixes of generation, loads, customers. And as people start to see what can be done by just linking together a few buildings, I think in other states they're going to start seeing the need to build them in their places as well. So, I mean, New York, California, they're going to be the leaders, Hawaii, and yeah, I think it's going to be pretty big.
So Matt, I caught one of the questions out of the corner of my eye here. I'll look at a few others while you answer the first one here. Somebody had asked early in the webinar, is there any particular chemistry for storage that is kind of got the advantage right now? I don't know if you got into the technical details.
Yeah, I'm no engineer, but I know that lithium ion is the primary storage source being sought by a lot of microgrid developers, and that's just because, with iteration, the costs are going down so much over the years, and it's proven to be pretty reliable at this point as well. So, but you'd have to link up with, I think, somebody who actually engineers this stuff, and the chemistry is a little bit beyond me.
So a question here from Robert Harris, have you encountered many building code restrictions or a situation where a person is required to be interconnected versus someone trying to go off-grid? It's actually an interesting example. I think I've heard of a few Las Vegas casinos, for example, that were looking to disconnect from the utility with the argument that they could get power cheaper, and there being a legal tussle about whether or not they owed some money to the utility for plans that the utility had made to supply those customers. Are you seeing issues like that with microgrid development?
Yeah, there's a question of how much the utilities are owed at this point for customers who might depart their load from the service territories. And yeah, in the case of Las Vegas, it was something like $127 million that NV Energy asked of them before they could go off and start self-generating. And that's going to be a problem in other states too. As far as building codes restrictions go, I know that the PACE Energy Law Center, they've done a little bit of work on building code restrictions, and that's a little bit more micro detail than I got into, but yeah, that does play a part with any distributed energy project where you can link up, basically.
So interesting question here, and particularly relevant given that we have some research coming out on rural co-ops in the next couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
How can electric cooperatives, generation and transmission cooperatives, but also the distribution cooperatives be involved in developing microgrids so they won't feel like they need to oppose them?
So this is something that I've been working on at least for a little while, a side project. generation and transmission cooperatives serve distribution cooperatives, and they're mostly served by these all requirements contracts, which, with maybe like a little bit of leeway, give the stipulation that the cooperative has to purchase all of their energy from the generation and transmission cooperative. So I think I haven't heard of anybody moving in this direction, but I think there is an opportunity for G&Ts to provide this sort of service, just like utilities are now starting to provide this microgrid as a service to its customers. These G&Ts could provide a service to distribution cooperatives within their service territories in the same way that they're starting to build solar arrays in their territories for the distribution cooperatives, while not going from outside of the bounds of those all requirements contracts. So it's an interesting field to look at, especially when you consider that the G&T has all these kind of greater capital that they can raise too by just bringing all the distribution cooperatives together.
So in other words, it sounds like the generation transmission co-op, by being the aggregate of all the distribution ones, might be in a good place to, for example, help them raise the capital to build the generation component of a microgrid for the distribution co-op. Okay. We had another good question here that I was interested in seeing a response to. Oh, it's scrolling on me automatically. Sorry about that. Yeah, question here about whether or not, looking at the different regulatory climates. So, how are utilities handling this whole issue of grid modernization, and particularly, are there any arguments that you would suggest for microgrids and distributed generation for utilities in states that have these service monopolies or exclusive franchises? How do you make the argument for microgrids in Minnesota, for example, versus in New York, where you've got retail choice already?
I think you need to argue that this is going to be a way to include more people in the electricity system at this point, and to concentrate a lot of the economic benefits of next generation energy systems in specific areas. So for instance, I know that the Boston Redevelopment Authority just released a study on community microgrids within Boston, and they're talking about having these sort of environmental justice, social justice microgrids in some of the poorer sections of towns, just to help them save money a little bit more. And so I think that if you can use these microgrids and site them in places where, people might need to save money a little bit more, where they could help more people, where you want to put an electric vehicle charging place, you can bring a lot more attributes and concentrated attributes to the grid than just doing it sort of willy-nilly over the wide grid.
And yet, though, I'm thinking about an example in Minnesota, for example, as part of a grid modernization process. The incumbent utility is saying essentially, we want to experiment with solar and storage, or we want to learn from how that could interface with our distribution system, but in order to do that, we want to own it, we want to rate base it. Is there going to be an opportunity for third parties to participate and to make that pitch in these regulated states?
Only if the utilities commissions make it so.
A very brief but very to the point answer. Thank you. So, question here from someone looking at particularly municipalities where you have a municipal utility, a city-owned utility. Examples of whole towns being done as microgrids?
So I've heard that Fort Collins is starting to introduce different microgrid elements into their town. And I know other municipalities are starting to bring the elements together. But again, there's sort of this interesting dynamic going on where a lot of municipal utilities, just like the distribution cooperatives, have these all requirement or take or pay contracts with a larger joint action agency or maybe an investor-owned utility. So it's hard to go outside the bounds of that contract when you're trying to self-supply your own energy, because you're working together with a conglomerate of other municipal utilities to source your energy in a, what they think is a more cheap way to do it, usually from centralized power plants, but there is, an opportunity now to do it at the distribution level that should be looked at by joint action agencies.
So in other words, it'd be pretty hard for Fort Collins, if they had that kind of contractual arrangement to
Yeah.
be sort of islandable as an entity, because there's no way they'd be allowed to put 100% of their
Yeah.
generation needs within the city.
Yeah, and Fort Collins is pretty unique because I think they've consciously worked over like the past decades just to build up 100% renewable energy supply too, or going towards that path. And you really have to set up contract negotiations where you're going to get your energy from, and it's a pathway, that's for sure.
So distribution utilities, don't ignore your contracts. This one's sort of a specific question, looking at some findings by Harvard Law School about whether or not Boston has jurisdiction allowing the sale of electricity across the right-of-way, public streets, for example, versus the notion that private utilities hold that right-of-way. That's actually interesting, because I'm thinking about this in the context of Minneapolis, where some of the interesting stuff that's been happening here is the result of a franchise negotiation which did incorporate that right-of-way, and I guess the implication there is that the city does hold that right unless they give it away. Is that your read as well, that cities do at least inherently hold the right over their public right-of-way and therefore could grant exceptions to the monopoly utility rule?
Well, I mean, speaking to Massachusetts, directly, Harvard Law School has done some great work on interpreting this law, and I think it's like a 100-page thesis or something like that. And frankly, it's thought that the municipality holds the control over this. In every state, the franchise rights in terms of what the agreement the cities that hold with the utility and in their exclusive territory, also known as the franchise, it's still a little bit blurry, legally untested, whether microgrids can go in these territories and cross public right-of-ways. So, there needs to be some kind of survey done to clarify this matter for microgrid developers everywhere, I think.
Or a deep-pocketed developer needs to take it to court, in other words.
Exactly.
So, interesting question here in terms of what kind of long-term maintenance is required in order to keep a microgrid going over time?
I'm not exactly sure if it's any different from any other distributed generation. I think the question asker, sorry, I missed the name there.
David K.
Yeah. Email me after, and I can try and hook you up with people who actually work on the microgrids and you can talk about the different operations and maintenance costs that go into it too, and how it might be different from traditional generation projects.
We didn't release his email on the presentation document, but of course all of ILSR staff are listed on our About page along with our email contact information. Matt's at mgrimley@ilsr.org if you'd like to pester him with follow-up questions. Interesting question here, I think, about kind of the implication for microgrids versus this notion of universal public service, and whether or not the expansion of microgrids sort of undermines this notion that we have one entity that serves all of us versus having a lot of independent entities. I know this comes up also a lot in the context of solar, about, is it just wealthy people that are going to be able to participate and leave the rest of the grid in its poor shape for the rest of us?
Yeah, there is an idea that that's might happen. It's a little far out, and getting further to the point, microgrids for just wealthy people, solar for just wealthy people. And I think if you have a strong policy direction, you can make sure that it's not just for one part of the grid and one part for the other. You might always need the larger grid. I think you will need the larger grid, and you will need ways to keep the power going there, but there are different things you can do at the distribution level that haven't ever been done before that can be done now that microgrids can help develop.
I just want to say to Brad, in your question about IOUs and co-ops, I have no idea what disintermediation means. Maybe Matt does, but if not, maybe you could repost your question and reword it so that we can answer it, because sounds like it's an interesting concept. Another one here I thought that was interesting, sort of asked, are there any examples where the load balancing for renewables is handled with some other kind of storage technology other than batteries? They asked specifically about biomass, but do you know of storage that's being done in microgrids that's not battery based?
Yeah, so I've heard of storage, well, just being able to divert the energy flows from intermittent renewable energies. I think in Kodiak Island, or maybe it's St. Paul Island in Alaska, they divert it to, I think, some sort of indoor heater or water heaters. I know Great River Energy does the same thing too with just really cheap power. They store it in people's water heaters around their service territory. I've heard of pumped hydro being used too in a different island microgrid out in the Canary Islands. So yeah, there's a lot of possibilities there. And yeah, pumped hydro, just for those who don't know about, comprises like 98% of the world's storage technology at this point. And all it is just pumping water up a hill and then bringing it downhill when you need that energy at the end of the day. And it's time tested, and a lot of people have tried it before. So yeah, there are other ways to do it. Speaking specifically to biomass, I've heard tell that there's a biomass based microgrid out at the University of Minnesota Morris campus, although I tried looking into it and I couldn't find much information on it, but it might be worth looking into a little bit more.
I know Morris has actually been trying to be sort of 100% self-reliant on its energy resources, and I believe they have a biomass, maybe it's a cogeneration plant in addition to 2 wind turbines.
Yeah, that sounds right.
But I think they were having trouble with the operation of the biomass facility.
I
wanted to touch back on the thing you said about Great River Energy. For folks who don't know, Great River Energy is a generation and transmission cooperative serving a lot of distribution cooperatives in the state of Minnesota. To get to that issue of storage, I believe this is one of the things that they're providing. I can't remember if it's at the G&T level or one of the distribution co-ops, but we have a community solar program in the state, and a lot of co-ops have started providing community solar. And I think I remember that one of the things that they're doing is giving people a very discounted community solar subscription if they also take a water heater. Or if they make the subscription, they also get a free water heater, an electric water heater, which then the utility can use and control and store excess generation. They're looking at as a way to both balance the variability of solar, but also to simply store cheap power by preheating folks' water heaters at nighttime with wind power, or during the daytime with solar power.
Yeah, and in microgrid specifically, you see a lot of that sort of flexible loads where you can use one load to absorb something when you have too much of it, or you can turn another load down. And yeah, that's a great example.
Couple other here. This is a big picture question from Robert. Isn't the real market challenge to shift the regulatory paradigm from a rate-based investment incentive, and maybe you can explain that a little bit, to an approach that shifts the motivation by allowing some method for utilities to earn, as a partner in a distributed generation investment?
Yeah, it is a big shift among utilities, but I mean, New York proved it. You could do it in like 5-10 years, and it's not impossible, I think, is the point that we want to get across. And I think the benefits that will be reaped from considering other sorts of performance-based regulation rather than rate-based regulation, which is basically just they get returns on whatever they build, 10% returns. So seeing that shift to performance-based regulation is something that's entirely possible and just within the will of the public and the utility commissioners.
So we'll probably take a couple more questions here. I think what we will do, depending on the number of questions that we have left over, we may also do like a FAQ document that we can publish on our website if we have a number of questions that are unanswered. Can just publish a blog post that would get to a lot of those. Of course, Matt's email address has been provided as well. So I'm going to look through here. Here's one here reacting to some specific news. Do you have any reaction to the Department of Energy's recent $4 million grant for Commonwealth Edison to build up to 6 microgrids in Chicago? Looks like it was a story in Utility Dive today. You have been busy doing other things like preparing for this webinar, Matt, but I'm curious if you have any reaction to that.
So the Department of Energy and all the state utility commissions, we mentioned it in the report too, public funding at this stage, early stage of commercialization of microgrids is pretty vital to their success. There's no standard business model, and so you need a little bit of financial help to get your feet on the ground to test out these new models. For instance, Borrego Springs, I think, was almost entirely funded by state, federal money. Even the Stafford Hill microgrid got a little bit of Department of Energy money. So that part, you know, it's looking ahead. As far as ComEd, I think they wanted to rate base $300 million worth of microgrids, and that might have just been for the 6 microgrids in their territory. And that's something that I think the public and utility commissioners need to look out for, because a lot of these utilities right now are saying, like, you know, there's a lot of benefits that can't be quantified. There's a lot of things that are unmeasurable at this point, but maybe we need to find out a system to measure this, what benefits. Maybe we need to find out a grid system that focuses on benefits that other customers can bring to the grid, other than just, you know, continuing the same old system of development where utilities have traditionally been pretty slow moving.
And that would be, for example, something that's happening in New York with the reforming the energy vision process, where the idea is that you create a platform and a market at the distribution level where any actor can come in and offer something of value to the grid, and there will be a way to price that and for them to participate. Sort of taking this to the extreme in terms of being able to price the benefits of microgrids. One last question here. Yeah, this is kind of interesting. Looking at, you know, I know this report was mostly focused or entirely focused on microgrids in the United States, where we're seeing a lot of interesting stuff. A question here about whether or not you've seen any development, interesting development in the developing world, you know, in particular places where you don't have already existing grid infrastructure.
Yeah, I've heard, read, talked to people who said that microgrids in the developing world are actually a little bit easier, because you're often not having to build over a grid that's already there, and so you can build from the ground up, basically. And when you're designing these new sort of electricity systems, it's a lot easier to do that. So you can get solar and storage in there right away, just wire the wires up in the most optimal fashion. You know, the grid today is built on a historical basis. It's just where power was needed from like 1900 to 1950 to 1970 to today. If you don't have to do that, you can build it up in an optimal fashion. I've heard that it's a lot more cost effective than building microgrids on an already developed grid here. I know that I'll give a shout out to Microgrid Knowledge, probably one of the best sites for journalism around microgrids right now, and they have a lot of stories around microgrids in the developing world right now and how they're helping people out.
Well, Matt, thanks for taking all of my questions and all the questions from the audience.
My pleasure.
Just want to highlight the full report is available for download from our website, ilsr.org. We've got a couple great podcasts. If you have further questions, feel free to email either myself or Matt. We may be putting them together. And again, the video recording of this webinar will be available within the next week or two once we are able to process it. I'll let Rebecca wrap up if there's anything else, but thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you.